It's day 5 of the Israel-Hamas war, and a shadow of apocalypse is now looming over Gaza. The Israeli war machine has pulled out all guns, but Hamas is still firing rockets and striking South Israel. India's top conflict reporters Gaurav Sawant and Ashutosh Mishra are near the Gaza border. Here is their latest dispatch.
Blocks after blocks smashed to rubble. Neighborhoods in the sealed-off Gaza pounded by unrelenting Israeli airstrikes.
The style of attack is barbaric. I mean, the visuals are ISO visuals. In a way, this is our 9/11, and we're standing strong. We're standing strong. We will overcome this.
Home to some 2 million people in an area of 140 square miles, more than half of them living in poverty. The tiny Gaza Strip has plunged into a humanitarian crisis, with food, fuel, electricity and water supplies cut off amidst the Israeli siege. Ordinary Palestinians crowded into UN schools and a shrinking number of safe neighborhoods. Meanwhile, sporadic fire by Hamas continued to pound southern Israeli territory. On Tuesday afternoon, barrages of rockets pounded Ashkelon and Tel Aviv. There were no immediate reports of casualties.
ये जो आप सामने टुकड़ा रखे हैं, ये है वो रॉकेट जो दरअसल आया हमास की ओर से। इसकी लंबाई देखिए, यही वो रॉकेट है, लगभग 1.5 फुट लंबा, जिसका अब ये खाली शेल है, लेकिन ये खाली शेल भी मैं उठा नहीं सकता। और ये रॉकेट जब घर में गिरा, इसने इस तरह की तबाही मचा। आप समझिए कि किस तरह की क्षमता हमास की है कि जो इतने बड़े बड़े रॉकेट वो इस्तेमाल कर रहा है और इससे नुकसान पहुंचा रहा है। और ये देखिए नुकसान भी कैसा है, उसकी क्षमता देखिए। ये पूरी जो दीवार है 1.5 फीट चौड़ी, इस पूरी दीवार को उसने भेद दिया था, पूरे घर को। और ये देखिए ऊपर तक नुकसान, ऊपर 3 से 4 मंजिला तक नुकसान हुआ है लोगों का।
With heavy mobilization along the Gaza Strip, Israel appears increasingly likely to launch a ground offensive into the 40-kilometer-long swath wedged among Israel, Egypt and the Mediterranean.
आप ये सोच नजर दौड़ाइए, पुलिस की एक गाड़ी यहाँ, पुलिस की एक गाड़ी यहाँ पर और सेना की गाड़ियाँ यहाँ पर। पूरा प्रयास यही है कि जल्द से जल्द अब यहाँ पर अगर हमास के आतंकवादी किसी पॉकेट में छिपे हैं, किसी बिल्डिंग में छिपे हैं, किसी नुक्कड़ पे, किसी छत पर, घर की छत पर या फिर किसी कमरे में, तो एक एक कमरे को खाली कराया जा रहा है। ये वो इलाका है जहाँ सबसे ज्यादा असर था हमास के आतंकवादियों का दक्षिणी इजराइल में। घरों में घुसकर यहाँ लोगों को मौत के घाट उतारा था।
The United States expressed complete solidarity with Israel and warned Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah militant group against supporting Hamas.
Let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that. These atrocities have been sickening.
A momentous challenge ahead for Israel to rescue dozens of civilians and Israeli soldiers held hostage by Hamas militants safely from the narrow, densely populated Gaza Strip. With Gaurav Sawant and Ashutosh Mishra from southern Israel, Bureau Report, India Today.
One of the most terrifying tragedies of this war has been the killing of women and children. Israeli soldiers have claimed that close to 40 babies were beheaded by the Hamas at a kibbutz near the Gaza border. Images of blood-soaked cradles have stunned the world.
Unspeakable horrors of the Hamas terror attacks on Israel. Reports suggest Hamas terrorists brutally slaughtered, beheaded 40 babies in a kibbutz, Kfar Aza, near the Gaza Strip in the most monstrous way. This is what an Israeli general has claimed. Cribs overturned, strollers left behind. Barbaric enough to send chills down anyone's spine. The entire world has reeled in horror.
it's hard to even explain exactly just the mass casualties that happened right here. In fact, the Israeli military says they still don't have a clear number, but I'm talking to some of the soldiers and they say what they've witnessed as they've been walking through these different houses, these different communities, babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said. Gunned down, families completely gunned down in their beds. You can see some of these soldiers right now comforting each other. Many of them reserves who jumped into action, leaving their own families behind as well.
The Israeli government has sent out a big warning to the Hamas terrorists for allegedly killing innocent babies.
We had hundreds massacred, families wiped out in their beds and their homes, women brutally raped and murdered, over 100 kidnapped, including children. It's only gotten worse. They took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
Those who behead children, burn women, and kill Holocaust survivors will be deleted. The clear message and full support I conveyed today to our dear fighters at the Gaza border.
Some soldiers say they found babies with their heads cut off and entire families gunned down in their beds.
We walk door after door. We kill a lot of the terrorists. We are stronger than them. They are aggressive. They are very bad. They cut head of children, cut head of women, but we are stronger than them.
The Israeli Defense Forces were removing the bodies of victims found in the area when they found the children's mutilated remains. According to reports, Hamas terrorists unleashed barbarism while the babies were sleeping with their parents, dragged them into the streets, beheading most of them and shooting the remaining dead, is what the Israeli government claims.
It's not a war. It's not a battlefield. You see the babies, the mother, the fathers in their bedrooms, in their protection rooms, and how the terrorists kill them. It's not a war. It's not a battlefield. It's a massacre. It's a terror activity. So you can look it on yourself. It's something that I never saw in my life.
Another horrific image from the kibbutz Reim shows the terrorists forcing their entry and lying in ambush. One of the terrorists is seen attacking a passenger car which arrives unsuspecting at the gate, opening fire from point-blank range and gunning down all occupants of the vehicle. More than 700 Israelis were killed in one day in the kibbutz near the Gaza border. The largest terror attack in a single day in the country's history, where 1,200 Israelis have died. With Gaurav Sawant and Ashutosh Mishra across Israel, Bureau Report, India Today.
Where does Israel's war against the Hamas go from here? For some very sharp insights, I'm joined on India Today's News Track, live and exclusive from London, by Emmy-winning producer, award-winning author and journalist Adrian Levy. Our viewers in India would remember Mr. Levy as being the author of a book called The Siege, which was the definitive account of the 26/11 attacks. He's also researched intelligence agencies like RAW, like ISI, understands the workings of the Shin Bet and the Mossad, understands the ins and outs of how Israeli society works. Thank you very much, Mr. Levy, for joining us. This is a very tough time for Israel, and we appreciate your time and the benefit of your insights. So thank you.
It's a pleasure to join you, and hopefully we can cover some interesting ground here.
Oh, absolutely. I want to start by asking you, Mr. Levy, about how you see this war that Israel has now started against the Hamas in Gaza proceed. There's talk of the inevitability of a ground invasion, given that Gaza is densely populated and that Israel hasn't been able to occupy Gaza successfully before this, which is why in mid-2000s they chose to come back. How do you see this invasion progress?
Yeah, I think there are no really easy options. I think there's a time of national mourning taking place as Israel begins to calibrate what actually happened over the last several days in terms of the massacres at the festival site at Kfar Aza, the massacres in Sderot and Kibbutz Be'eri, and that process of accounting and working out what happened in terms of this devastating intelligence failure, and then the slow reaction and counter-reaction by IDF. Obviously, it's not simply Mossad, which is the external intelligence agency that's the spotlight is on. It's also Shin Bet, the domestic intelligence agency, let's say, like IB in India, and Amman, which is the very powerful intelligence agency attached to the military, a bit like MI in India, military intelligence in India. So this audit, if you like, is taking place now, and at the same time, rapid planning. Another difficulty, of course, is there's a big disconnect between the intelligence establishment and the military and Netanyahu. And that set in through political measures that he was taking to isolate the judiciary, creating, as your viewers will have seen, mass protests in Israel. So the attacks came at a time where there was huge polarization and a disconnect between military intelligence and the Prime Minister, who drafted extremists into his cabinet who the military also did not like. So what will the military do next? I mean, we're waiting to see if there'll be a cabinet of national unification of sorts, whether there can be more flavors that come into that cabinet. But a ground invasion certainly looks tricky and, if not disastrous, potentially for Palestinian people, of course, and for Israel too. We look at where Israel has before made these kind of incursions. They've never ended well. Look at 82 in Lebanon. That led to the creation of Hezbollah, and then from that we saw those massive attacks on American bases, the Marines, and spates of kidnapping, etc., and the fully fledged involvement of Iran with Hezbollah on a border. Other calculations and things that you should consider are what will happen in Syria. On the Syrian border, there's been a bit of tit-for-tat shelling and bombing.
So we'll unpack those one by one. Let's just spend a moment on the intelligence failure which you referred to in your first answer.
Sure.
Now, you, in your book, The Exile, looked at Al-Qaeda in Iran. You've looked at 26/11, which you researched. So you've studied failure by intelligence agencies at a very deep professional level. Now, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, amongst the world's most fearsome intelligence agencies, and it bedevils people who are watching at this time when they wonder how could the world's best intelligence agencies not see what was happening right below their nose in daylight.
Yeah, well, three quick hot responses to that. We don't know what they knew. I mean, Egypt at the moment is saying that it warned Amman and gave very specific warnings about a build-up of rockets and other material, and that those warnings were not processed or acted upon. There's also some kind of suggestion that there was an internal disconnect between the three or four different agencies that were considering material as to what was going in Gaza. There's a political paralysis in Egypt whereby politicians are disregarding military and intelligence establishments. And, you know, a very important thing to say here is that intelligence is overly fetishized, if you like. We think that these agencies can see and hear everything because we see stories about Pegasus, we hear about incursions into every kind of messenger and social media app, and we assume that their grid is a grid that will miss nothing. It's simply not the case. Analysis is what matters, not simply data, and the speed and depth of analysis is what actually dictates the effectiveness of intelligence. So what's gone on here won't be necessarily a collection issue, but it will more than likely be an analytical issue. I mean, India has faced these issues in the past as well. However quickly India can process information on terror events that are taking place in Kashmir or in the Punjab, in other places, it has to be able to analyse the data coming in as well as deciding, you know, whether or not the data is valid. So I guess that will be something that everybody will be looking at. Netanyahu is massively unpopular. The Prime Minister, remember that. And this has been an issue. He doesn't have the coherent leadership, and perhaps that might be at the core of what we're seeing here, as well as devastating planning, effective planning, I hate to say, by Hamas.
No, so let's spend a moment on the kind of military precision that the Hamas was able to engineer. Now, you know the general military capability associated with the Hamas. Now, this seemed to be a massive, audacious attack executed with very high-end military precision. Does the Hamas have the operational expertise, in your view, to be able to do this themselves? Or is it highly likely that whether it is the Iranians or other military forces, like professional trained military personnel, who are helping them plan this attack, because they are attacking the Iron Wall, there's the Iron Dome, all of which Israel has as counter-defensive, and they're able to breach the fence and send all these records in, all these rockets in, and the system doesn't respond in the way that it should have. So this has been planned in great detail. How do you think they did it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's taken an enormous amount of time. You know, they refer particularly to a trigger being the Israeli raid on Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. That's why they gave the name to this operation as Al-Aqsa Flood. And that was a year back. So it would suggest that, you know, there's at least a year of sharpened planning, training, preparation. But if you look at the components in the operation, they're audacious and simple. The kind of parasending and paraflying, the use of multiple barrages of rockets, the simple targeting of the wall with bulldozers, etc., and the hitting of successive targets along or parallel and adjacent to the Gaza border, that rave site, etc., which were all soft targets, and if anything, filled with people who were pacifist or left-leaning and looking for a two-state solution. So yes, extraordinary preparations. There's no evidence yet as to what help has been given by logistics, training, otherwise by Iran. Obviously, we know that Hamas is extremely close to the Iranian leadership, and previously weapons supply, cash, etc., has been given to them. There's also a connection and sheltering that's given in the Lebanon, and there has been you know, much work and research done looking at that. But it's too early yet to say if there's definitive proof linking Iran. Iran celebrated and very quickly, for political reasons, distanced itself slightly from the planning of events while celebrating their nature. So these are processes and analytical pathways which Israel will have to go down with the help of other global intelligence agencies over the next months. And it may take that long to debone this and work this out.
As of now, this is largely the Israel Defense Forces versus the Hamas. There's been some sporadic fire from the Hezbollah, which the Israeli artillery responded to. Is it inevitable almost that the Hezbollah will get involved? Do you see this escalate? You mentioned Syria earlier. Do you see Syria getting involved militarily? Can this stay restricted to Israel versus Gaza, or is an escalation quite probable?
I don't think it is probable, but it is an apocalyptic scenario whereby we see Israel surrounded by firefights on the Syrian border, on the border with Lebanon, with the Gaza border, and of course the West Bank is also in turmoil. And then there's the internal Arab-Israeli population. As we know, there was an uprising from that section in 2021 and 2022. So what this points to, the first thing to say, sort of reflecting back on that, is that Lebanon is in a very, very difficult situation itself right now. It's facing near bankruptcy. Its economy is in free fall. And it would be very difficult for Hezbollah to usher in that kind of conflict with Lebanon ailing so badly after the ship carrying nitrates and fertilizer exploded in Beirut in the harbour, devastating the city and compounding its economic crisis. So I think that's unlikely. Syria too is preoccupied, although Iran has been effective in building an alliance in Syria up until now. Seems unlikely that that will be something that they'll press. So this will become an issue that will probably restrict itself to Gaza, and then likely the West Bank will become involved. So what does this tell us? It tells us that there can be no real military solution. Again, you know, this is a political crisis, and it's one brought around by Netanyahu. He abandoned a two-state solution, failed to recognize that there was a future for Palestine and Palestinians, and persuaded a group of Israelis that the only answer was sheer force. Sheer force has not worked again. It didn't work in 2014, in 2008, in 2003. It didn't work in 1982 with the invasion of Lebanon. So we're left with many people asking what will be the political settlement that has to be made.
But is anyone in Israel even discussing a political settlement, especially given the barbarity of this attack, given the kind of elements in the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu, who himself is right, and then he's got extreme right ministers? Does this attack take away whatever minuscule opportunity there was for any settlement? Because no one's discussing that actively any longer.
It's too soon right now for anyone to be raising that. But those thoughts and discussions are happening privately. You know, you're seeing an enormous percentage of people disaffected with Netanyahu. You know, he has advocated for himself as a strongman leader who would resist political solutions, and he has been overseeing the country at its probably one of its worst ever defeats, an intelligence disaster. And so the political price for this will be enormous. He's trying to deflect already by blaming protesters for weakening the unification of the state, but he was the leader who came from offering military solutions. So you'll see these conversations happening privately when the mourning is done and when the shape of the regional conflict becomes clearer. There will again be a pressure placed on Netanyahu, and it will come from all sides. Remember the Saudi interest in evolving its peace plan for better or worse. That also is being protected by America. So Saudi has an interest, Mohammed bin Salman, in resurrecting that plan if it can. But of course, what we have to first see is what happens in Gaza. We have to watch closely what happens over the next week to 2 weeks. And it looks like a tragedy is unfolding there.
No, but given that Gaza has very heavy population density, do you think that this attack will actually lead to a lot of Israeli deaths as well? Because A, you've got many Israelis hostage. B, obviously the Hamas has thought this through. They've wargamed this at this level. They know what is coming. And are they potentially ready for it? Because if they're in, street-to-street kind of conflict, entrenched in windows, behind buildings, they can make it very difficult for the IDF to come in.
Yeah, I mean, of course it's unthinkable, and the majority of Palestinians are not to blame and do not support Hamas. Maybe less than a quarter of Palestinians in Gaza have shown any support for Hamas at all. And so collective punishment is being wreaked, which will be a hideous thing for the Palestinians and for outsiders to watch. And potentially war crimes may even be committed. And Israel's been warned about that because of the intensity of its bombing. These are hard issues to get into right now because of the state of mourning as we all come to terms with what's happened, more than 1,000 dead.
You mentioned the Israel-Saudi Arabia deal, where Tel Aviv and Riyadh were on the verge, with the help of the United States, of signing a historic deal. Is that now buried, at least in the foreseeable future?
I think the problem has always been the Netanyahu side and his inability to balance his extremist coalition. I think the Saudis are prepared to step forward and recognise, and other states will follow. Potentially even Pakistan, where there have been feelers put out very sensitively, even though the Pakistani state denies it. But can Netanyahu now do that? This is what's going to be interesting. He may not survive this disaster himself. So I think the political ramifications inside Israel are not clear. And likewise, although America is moving at speed and others to try and shore up the Saudi deal, it's not yet clear whether that will be able to progress or realign itself. It is not clear.
How do you see this conflict in the Middle East potentially impact the other flashpoints globally? The Russia-Ukraine war, China has been eyeing Taiwan for a very long time. Do they sense that the US is occupied, the rest of the world has its eyes on Russia, Ukraine, on the Middle East, and therefore does it increase the prospects of China making a dash for the Taiwan Straits?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, we saw also with Ukraine that although that thought may have entered, the private discussions that took place in Beijing, they saw the European response and NATO response and decided they didn't want that. I mean, China's economy is going through some upheaval at the moment in terms of its enormous property bubble and the property crisis in Shanghai. So I think what they're looking for is commerce and trade solutions. Also, in the new multipolar world, they've advanced themselves as interlocutors in other disputes. Remember, there are back channels taking place in real time now that don't involve America for once. China has been one of those interlocutors. Saudi has been another. Look at the Yemen back channel in that dispute there. That's not American run. And so in this new multipolar world, inside which India is also rising, it's hard to see that the conflict would spread in that sense. Whether or not there will be agents provocateurs who exacerbate the problem, that is likely. Iran will do so, Russia will do so, and North Korea will do so in terms of who they supply, where their munitions and arms and sensitive technologies go. That undoubtedly will happen, which will fan the flames. But whether it will spread into a broader conflict, I think that is unlikely. The real issue right now will be what happens on the Lebanon border and the regional crisis, what form that takes if Israel does take a tremendously difficult decision and go in with ground forces in Gaza.
We saw America respond to terror attacks by attacking Afghanistan. Separately, they also attacked Iraq, and many analysts now think those were overreactions. Because nothing much came of the battle in Afghanistan in the end. Maybe America didn't need to spend so much money, lose so many lives. Do you think Israel also, tough as it seems to suggest, but could Israel also run the risk of potential overreaction, which ultimately proves much costlier?
It's absolutely the fear that everybody has. America, at one stage, in November and December 2001, held the high moral ground, and the world grieved with Americans seeing what happened on 9/11. And yet what happened afterwards, in the war on terror, as you pointed out, led to the death of at least 1 million people and $6 trillion of damage spent, unnecessary and illegal wars that took place, and the disintegration of societies in Libya, in Iraq, etc. So, and Afghanistan, of course, entropy in Pakistan. America also, and it's really important to remember this, did massive damage through use of its security, intelligence service and intelligence contractors to its own rules-bound system. It engaged in disappearances, in actions and interrogation actions that have been ruled to be torture, ruled repeatedly, including by the US Congress. And in doing so, by stepping around its obligations internationally and its international conventions, the Geneva Conventions, etc., the rules of war, commonly described as the rules of war, it undid its own rules-bound system. And so America ended up being an enormous loser and, in fact, creating massive instability around the world for Americans abroad, for American service people abroad. And the result has been also a political price to pay for the intelligence services, particularly CIA and its contractors. So Israel has to be aware of this, and no doubt these conversations are taking place right now, pointing to the overreaction. Vengeance is not going to be a solution for Israel. It was not a solution for President Bush and for America.
The Yom Kippur War of 1973 was one of the big failures of the Israeli intelligence. Do you think that this will probably go down in history as the biggest failure? Some people are calling this Israel's 9/11, but the counter to that is that 9/11 involved the use of aeroplanes as missiles targeted at buildings, and that was quite unexpected. It was a black swan event, as it were. Whereas this is not really 9/11, because this is the kind of attack that Israel should have been expecting, even if it weren't, and therefore it's not like using aeroplanes as missiles. This is something that Israel really should have been wargaming and preparing for. So is it really Israel's 9/11 or not?
Well, there's two questions wrapped up in there. First of all, there are massive similarities in that both are enormous intelligence failures. So the important thing to remember is that in 1999 and 2000, the CIA had active intelligence from Malaysia and other places, Yemen, etc., that showed that an operation was brewing. They knew who was likely involved in it, and they knew that America would be the target. And that intelligence was stovepiped disastrously and kept away from FBI and internal security agencies. That's been well documented inside the 9/11 report, etc., and deboned. And of course, this now with Gaza and the attacks made at the weekend is an enormous intelligence failure too. So in that sense, the comparison is worth making. But more than that, in terms of its scale and its impact on the reputations of the intelligence service, the military, and the Netanyahu government, this is undoubtedly one of the worst crises that Israel has faced.
Where do you see this go from here? What happens next? What's your sense of what lies ahead in the next 7, 10, 15 days?
I think there's an enormously difficult auditing period where Israel has to come to terms with what took place, and hopefully inside that there'll be some kind of transparency whereby people will get to understand why this has happened, what its cost really was. And also, they have to fight the false news. You'll see stories racing around about, babies being decapitated. In the fog of war, horrible things are being said, some of which may not be true. So actually understanding what happened, the true nature of the horror, that'll be one key thing. Two, understanding the consequences of the hostage taking. That is a human crisis that's going to burn on for potentially years if we look at what's happened before. Hamas has threatened to execute hostages, which is a chilling reminder of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda's strategies, something horrendous. And then there's the refugee crisis and the humane tragedy that's taking place in Gaza, which we have to watch and unpick and feel for the people in Gaza who have nowhere to run to. And wonder at what their futures may be. So there's so many things to weigh up and consider, and so many things for societies and the international communities to consider, because the failure has been also international, not simply a failure of politics in Israel and its right-wing government, but a failure internationally to address this issue and to give Palestinians a sense of hope, or even an effective diplomatic runway, of which there is none.
Adrian Levy, your books are very forensic in the way that you approach matters, and that's exactly been your approach during this conversation as well, for being as objective, blunt, truthful as is possible. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking our time in a very tough hour for Israel and speaking to us and sharing your thoughts. That's well-known journalist, author, award-winning producer Adrian Levy talking to us about the Hamas attack and Israel's counteroffensive. Thank you, sir. Joining us now, live and exclusive on India Today, is Mr. Ehud Olmert, a former Prime Minister of Israel, served as the leader of the country from 2006 to 2009, was in fact in charge of governing Israel at the time of the 22-day war on Gaza in late 2008. Mr. Olmert, welcome to India Today. You're joining us at a time when the world's eyes are on Israel. So much sympathy in India and elsewhere with the people of Israel on the back of this barbaric attack by the Hamas. Could I start by getting you to explain your sense of the current state of play in Israel, the counter-offensive being mobilized by the Israeli Defense Forces? It seems as if Israel is getting set for a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. You were in charge of the country when the war with Gaza happened in 2008. Could you give us a sense of how this confrontation is shaping up from your perspective, sir?
Well, first of all, I have to say, to make it very clear and particularly, it's very important for me that the public opinion in your great country, India, will understand it. We are not set out to invade the Gaza district. We don't want to invade, we don't want to occupy. We want to reach out to the terrorists that perpetrated the mass killing of Israeli citizens in the last few days in the most brutal and inhuman manner. more than 1,200 Israeli citizens were butchered and murdered. Babies, 2 years old, 3 years old, their mothers. The mothers were raped in front of the children, and then they got a bullet in their head, and they were massacred with their parents and with their grandparents. So this is not something that any country can tolerate, and Israel set out to reach out for those who did it and to take the necessary measures in order to make sure that it will never be repeated again. But we don't have a war against those who are not involved. The innocent Israeli citizens were victims of terror and of brutality, and I certainly don't want any non-involved in Gaza to have to go through the suffering of war or something that they were not part of. One thing I can guarantee you, no Israeli will do anything similar to what these Palestinians, radicals, extremists, fundamentalists, ISIS-type people did to our citizens.
Mr. Olmert, given the fearsome capabilities of the Shin Bet, the domestic intelligence agency, the Mossad, the external intelligence agency of Israel, where do you think the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went wrong in not being able to join the dots? A lot of the training seemed to be happening in daylight, quite clearly visible to CCTV cameras, I'm sure to your ground human intelligence assets, to technical surveillance assets. How did the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus, in your view, miss all these signs?
Well, I'll tell you, there are two things. Independent, separate, but both have contributed to what we have seen now. One thing is that when Netanyahu became prime minister, he announced that his foremost priority is to destroy Hamas. Unlike me, in comparison to me, he said, I didn't destroy Hamas, he will destroy Hamas, with a very strong hand attitude towards the Hamas. In reality, he actually did the opposite. The choice that he had was to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority and with the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, towards a political solution of the Palestinian issue on the basis of a two-state solution, or to reduce the impact and the influence and the importance and the centrality of the Palestinian Authority. And the only way to do it was to promote Hamas. So the same organization that he swore to destroy, he actually promoted. And that has created a lot of expansion in the military strengths of Hamas, and he allowed hundreds of millions of dollars that came from Qatar to finance the Hamas, and that opened up also options for Iran to play a much greater role than they should have been allowed to play in promoting the status of Hamas. So this is one thing. The other thing is a question about the failure, or the appearance of failure, of one of the most sophisticated intelligence systems there are, which is the Israeli system. The Israeli military intelligence, the Israeli Secret Service, which are known to be really one of the best in the world. The truth is that we knew all the details. We saw everything. We saw all the preparations. Nothing was hidden from our eyes and the eyes of the very sophisticated cyber system that we have developed in Israel. We just were arrogant to believe that they can do it. So we saw all the preparations, and yet we said, they are not going to do it. This is just practice, this is just fooling out. They are not being able to accomplish what we see that they are training to do. And therefore, even in the last couple of days before the operation, we pulled down a military division from Gaza, from the nearby Gaza and moved it into another area. And we have actually emptied all of the area from a major, robust military presence, which was based not on not knowing all the details of all kinds of preparations, but of the arrogance that we believe that no one will dare do what they seem to have prepared to do. But they did it, and we were caught in surprise.
There's been some talk about a unity government of the more moderate factions in Israel coming together with the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you see that, Mr. Olmert, as being a possibility, that a cross-party unity coalition government getting together in this hour of crisis in Israel?
Well, I have my doubts about it. I think that when it comes to the military operations will take place according to the military plans, to the plans of the commanding generals of the Israeli army, and regardless of whether there is a unity government or not. So I'm not certain that that will make a difference. On the other hand, the present government of Netanyahu is made up of some very extremist right-wing messianic elements which have a strategic goal of eventually annexing all of the Palestinian territories and getting rid of the Palestinians or expelling them. This is something which is totally intolerable, unacceptable, and will never be supported by any part, a major part of the Israeli population. And the question is whether the more moderate elements in Israeli politics, which are now in opposition, want to be part of a government with these elements of messianic groups that are, I think, are not going to be not helpful and not supportive to achieve the national goals, which must be the priority of our country.
Now, when you were Prime Minister, Mr. Olmert, you took on the Hamas at the Gaza Strip, and yet Israel decided that Gaza was ungovernable, pulled back, the elections were held, the Hamas won. You can raise all the buildings you want. What do you think will be the end of the road for the Hamas? Because with all the attacks of the past, Israel hasn't been able to finish off the Hamas. Do you think this time that is possible? Or do you think ultimately you will have to negotiate, you will have to work towards a two-state solution? Because without that, this problem will keep popping its head up in some fashion or the other.
There is always a danger that this problem will continue to be part of our agenda and part of our lives. And we have experienced not only in our part of the world, but in other parts of the world, that sometimes these kinds of conflicts last longer than they should. And so this is one danger. On the other hand, by the way, when I was Prime Minister, there were elections in the territories, and Hamas was very successful in these elections because of the radical anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish attitude, which has characterized them from day one. They never wanted to make peace with Israel. They never wanted to negotiate politically with the state of Israel. They wanted to fight Israel. But I think as a result of the operations in the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, at the time that I was in charge, the conflict has been reduced to an entirely different scale. A scale which has lasted for almost 15 years. There were occasional confrontations, but nothing of the nature of what we have witnessed in the last few days. So while all these occasional confrontations between us and the Palestinians in Gaza were not always pleasant, and that it required occasionally to take severe measures against them, it was tolerable and manageable. what we were not prepared for and didn't address ourselves in time for the threats that were coming from Gaza to deal with it was the kind of military aggressive brutal operation that they perpetrated Saturday. So I think that Saturday, for the first time, they've changed the scale, the level, and the intensity of this conflict. And now it remains to be seen what will be the impact of the counter-offensive of Israel. I want to say two things, and it's very, very important for me that people in India will understand it and will sympathize with it. We are going to be very aggressive. We are going to go every place in Gaza and look out for the terrorists and do what needs to be done in order to deal with terrorists. We'll do every possible effort in order to avoid any unnecessary confrontations with non-involved in the civilian society. And we expect that the international public opinion, definitely the public opinion of Indians, and there are many Muslims living in India, and I appeal to them as well, they will understand that if sometimes the pictures that they will see from Gaza will not be pleasant, this is an unavoidable, inevitable result of the need to get rid of the terrorists in order to change the quality of life for both Palestinians and Israelis in that part of the world for a long time.
Okay. For sharing your thoughts on the future of this conflict and also the lapses that led to this Hamas attack, Ehud Olmert, thank you very much for joining us. That's the former Prime Minister of Israel, a man who has led the country in a battle against the Hamas, talking about the challenges at hand now and about the level of aggression that we're likely to see from Israel as they go all out to finish the Hamas once and for all. Ehud Olmert for joining us on India Today. Thank you, sir.